Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Cambridge Union. Tonight's debate is slightly different from the one you've got on your order paper. The new motion that we're debating tonight is this House believes too much trust is placed in science. So a slight variation there on the one that you've got written down. As ever, the format of the debate, though, is the same. It's a series of 6 alternating speeches, starting in proposition and then opposition, and continuing so on. As ever, this isn't just a debate between the speakers, it's a debate for everyone to get involved with too. If you'd like to make a point at any stage in the debate, please do so. You can stand up, say, on that point or point of information, but it is up to the speakers whether they choose to take your point. So please do respect it if they decide not to, but we hope they will. There's also be 2 floor rounds after the second speech and after the floor speech, where you will be invited to give your say on the motion. And then we'll vote at the end through the doors for anyone who's not here. Can I just say a special welcome to our youth councillors who are here from Unum. It's great to have you guys here, and I hope you enjoy the debate. Without further ado from me, I will get on with the main debate. Our first speaker this evening is Professor Alister McGrath, who is a professor at King's College London. Alister.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I love science. When I was young, I built a telescope to be able to watch the moon and the planets. I specialised in science in the 6th form. I studied chemistry at Oxford, and I did my DPhil in molecular biophysics under George Rader, who went on to be the director of the Medical Research Council. So I love science, but I want to say to you tonight that in proposing this motion, I speak to you not simply as a lover of science, but as a wounded lover who knows there is something that needs to be engaged, which means we must ask hard questions about science. Some want to defy science. I think we can deal with these very easily. But more worrying, I think, are those who want to deify science, to make it dominant in our culture, to make exclusive claims for its insights, to tell us that science trumps everything. And I'm here tonight as someone who loves science to plead with you not to allow it to be abused in this way. For we must be realistic about it. And I want to begin by emphasizing that yes, science has much that's good to say, but we need to recognize it has its limits. It raises some brilliant questions, but a lot of them transcend its ability to answer them. Now, Richard Dawkins and I disagree on quite a few things. For example, the question of God and the meaning of life, just to mention 2 small matters. But I think he's absolutely right when he says, I quote, "Science has no methods for deciding what is ethical." And I want to suggest to you, A, that he is right, and B, that for most of us here tonight, probably all of us, ethics really is important. What is right? What is wrong? How can I lead the good life? And I think for many of you, that is a question that really is on your agenda. And I think that many of us will just say, look, maybe science can't help us here, but that's not the end of the matter. It's not a criticism of science that it can't deliver ethical certainties. It's a bit like criticizing Strictly Come Dancing for not being able to tell us about Socratic metaphysics. The point I'm trying to make is simply this, that science is great, but it starts going wrong when scientists, or perhaps more likely, their less informed advocates, start thinking they can tell us about everything else. I want to emphasize science gives us important and welcome insights which we need to incorporate into our thinking. It's part of the rich tapestry of our intellectual world, and I want to emphasize it is an important part, but it is only a part. In other words, we need to bring others into this conversation. There is a round table at which science is an honored and welcome member, but there are others as well. I think most of you will know the kind of things I mean. And I suspect that most of you here tonight, possibly without knowing it, are actually critical realists when it comes to philosophy. What I mean by that is this, that we recognize that there are multiple levels of explanation to the things that really matter in life. There are more than one levels of explaining something. Watch what I'm doing. I'm pointing. Now, you could give a very good scientific explanation of what's just happened, and I would expect you to include in the explanation words such as neurons, electrical impulses, muscular contraction. But none of that will tell you why I pointed, which was to draw attention to this remarkable clock, which seems to fossilize some very important moment in time, doubtless many generations ago. And the point I'm trying to make here, and I think you've got it already, is look, these things here, they are both levels of explanation. They are both right. They're both part of the picture. And we do not tell the full picture if we don't include them both. Now, let's take this a stage further, because I think this is important. Science can tell you how you came to be in this world, and we all welcome that. But why are we here? That's a deeper level of questioning. It's a level we also need to engage with. And what I'm saying to you is this: science offers us one level of explanation. We need to welcome that and affirm it. But we also need to say there is more than this. And by denying that there is more to this, we are not telling the full story. What I'm suggesting tonight in this debate is that we need to hear the full story and not simply one aspect or one level of it. Science offers us one level of explanation of things which we need to accept and respect, but it's existentially inadequate. We need it to be expanded and supplemented if it's going to impact on real life. Questions about meaning and value, what Karl Popper called ultimate questions, ultimately lie beyond science, and that is no criticism of science at all. It's just saying science is science. Let's get used to it. There are other things we need to look at as well. Science helps us understand how we came to be here, but there are other questions that are deeper. One of the reasons why science has been so brilliantly successful, in my view, is its modesty. It has calibrated its intellectual tools, and it knows when they work, and it knows their limits. It's empirical. It reflects on what we experience and observe, and it asks what is the best explanation of these observations. And here's the point I want to make, and many of you have anticipated this, that science rightly changes its mind about things over time as new evidence becomes available. That's not some kind of relativism, anything goes. No, it's about responding to evidence as more evidence becomes available. And the point I'm emphasizing is that science is on a journey, and that journey is far from complete. That's why radical theory change in science is just such an important issue. You try something out, it seems to work for a while, then you begin to reason, begin to realize it doesn't work anymore. You need to change, you need to expand your vision, you need to up your game. If we'd been in this debating chamber a century ago when it was still 9:30, we would probably have been told that the universe was static. It's always been here. A century later, the universe had a beginning in the Big Bang, expanding. And I want to make the point to you, these are rather different ways of thinking. Science rightly changes its mind. It's a method. It's not a fixed body of beliefs. And that's a terribly important point. So let's not say science says this, as if that settles things. No, science says this at this moment, but we all recognize this is provisional in the light currently available of evidence, and it may change over time. When's the next paradigm shift going to take place? Science thinks certain things at the moment, and it does so with very good reason. But that doesn't mean it will think this in the future. And here I want to raise a difficult point, which really seems to me to relate to this theme of trusting science. We need to be critical, to ask those hard questions. Science can go badly wrong. It doesn't have to. It's like politics, religion, and sport. They're not wrong, but they can go wrong. And the point I want to make is that science can do this too. When these things mess up, they really do mess up. Many years ago, when I was studying chemistry at Oxford, I was in libraries late at night with a series of books by a man called Louis Fieser, professor of chemistry at Harvard University. A great man. He invented the synthesis of cortisone. Many of you will have benefited from that. But in 1942, he invented something else. The US military needed a new weapon in the Pacific War theater. They needed a weapon that would enable them to deal with troop formations in the jungles. He invented napalm. I want to say to you, as a chemist, I hang my head in shame that my discipline invoked that weapon of mass destruction. But I must end, and I want to do so by making a point that I think really is important. I want to say to you that we want to emphasize the importance of science, while at the same time recognizing it can go wrong. It needs to be accountable. And so that's why I'm asking you to support this motion. As a lover of science, I assure you, you will not be voting against science. You'll simply be voting against a limited, restricted vision of science. What I want you to vote for is a wondrous vision of the human intellectual enterprise which goes beyond science, which has a place for it and welcomes it, but nevertheless is able to see science as part of a bigger picture, which commands a sense by its radiance, by its imaginative power. And what I want you to say simply is this: let's welcome science. Let's welcome even more a bigger picture of reality, which is both existentially satisfying and intellectually transcendent. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor. To open the case for the opposition is someone who I'm sure will be familiar to lots of people in this room. Dr. Tim Lewens is a reader in the philosophy of the sciences here in Cambridge and has written and lectured extensively on the topic of evolution. Dr. Lewens.
Well, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more with what was just said. Unfortunately, it's not really relevant to the question that we've been asked to discuss today. Let's remind ourselves that the question is whether there's too much trust placed in science. We've not been asked whether science can tell us everything. We're not asked to discuss whether there's room at the table for non-scientific disciplines. We've not been asked to discuss whether Richard Dawkins is a megalomaniac. Instead, the question that we've been asked to consider is whether there's too much trust in science. Now, let me just... Yes, please.
I think it is kind of irrelevant because it highlights a problem we have in society where people use science to exclude the questions such as why. And therefore, accordingly, there is too much trust in science.
Okay.
So it is relevant.
So it seems to me that we can take on board all of this and view the proper image of science as a humble, fallible, albeit very valuable contributor towards debates, for example, in policy, towards health, towards our more general well-being. And so it seems to me that the key question to ask is, what would this country be like, what would the world be like if there really were too much trust placed in science? It's always very difficult to consider what would happen in such far-fetched circumstances. It really is rather peculiar to think that there might be too much trust placed in science. But let me suggest some features that we might observe were this to be the case. Well, first of all, I suppose if there were really too much trust placed in science, we'd be very happy to give scientists considerable autonomy in the way in which they formulate and subsequently execute their research projects. Government policy, because of course we trust scientists so much, government policy would simply involve listening directly to what the best scientists say. Were there, for example, to be an expert on the effects on health and society of various recreational drugs, government would simply listen to that person and take that person's advice on board. Policy regarding the environment would simply be a straightforward function of the best scientific advice offered. If there were, for example, no credible scientific data telling us that mobile phone masts might fry children's brains, then
it seems to me you're just painting a picture of what the world would be like if we placed absolute faith in science rather than too much trust. Surely too much trust could still be, you could still have too much trust without letting all these things happen.
No, not at all. I think that what I'm pointing to is a world where we trust overly. I'm not suggesting a world where everything is simply taken as gospel truth, so to speak. What I want to point to, though, are the ways in which there are many, many checks and balances suggesting that it's entirely implausible to think that too much trust is placed in science. If I can just continue sketching this, once again, far-fetched counterfactual circumstance where too much trust really is placed in science, we'd also be in, I think, just the situation that was sketched just now, whereby because scientists were viewed as having a very special insight into the functioning of the world around us.
Perhaps the influence of science and science community in devising policies in financial sector could be deemed as an indicator that we place too much trust in science and scientists.
Quite the contrary. It is indeed a case where we placed far too much trust in economists, and that's landed us. That's landed us in the trouble that we're in now, but there's no credible case for thinking that economics is a science, I'm afraid. What else would be the case if there were too much trust placed in science? Well, I suppose that maybe cosmetics firms would use trumped-up science in order to sell shampoo, and maybe also there'd be a fixation with floppy-haired Mancunian physicists on the television. Now, as it happens, of all the things I've sketched, only the last two are actually the case. None of the others is remotely an approximation to the way things are. As you all know, political judgment, that mysterious animal, regularly intrudes even when the very best scientists present their hard-gained results. Scientists themselves are subject to extraordinarily intrusive regimes of oversight. Informed consent is required for almost any instance of medical experimentation, regardless of whether or not it genuinely forms a threat to the research subjects. Of course, I'm not trying to suggest that these things should be entirely unregulated. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the extreme level of intrusion suggests it's not remotely a world where too much trust is placed in science. Yeah, I'll take one more and then I think I'd better get on.
I'm Darley Fitzwilliam College. Sorry to be a pest again, but I feel that the examples being given so far are where science has been ignored in fields where it can actually help. And so there it's being ignored due to humans being absolute retards, such as in politics. But the issue, I think, which should be questioned is where science kind of is expected to answer in areas where it cannot, such as in the issues of why we are here. And I also like to raise the issue of, I think it was Bertrand Russell, and I don't know the words exactly, but I think he said something along the lines of the only way to access knowledge is via science. And so if intellectuals like that in our era are having that kind of belief, then surely that is evidence of people putting too much faith in science.
I'm not sure that I'd agree with you. I mean, I think it would be very difficult to use Russell's work as an exemplar of the kind of unique importance of the scientific method, given how so much of Russell's own work involves mathematical reflection and mathematical reflection on primarily philosophical questions. In a lot of what Russell does, there's not that much science put to work at all. But let me just move on, and I'll try to conclude. We live in a world where science is heavily regulated by research ethics committees, ethical codes of conduct. Scientific advice itself is regularly ignored by politicians because they fear the impact of adverse publicity and maybe adverse public opinion. And we also live in a world where scientific advice is regularly overrun by spurious, I think, implementations of the so-called precautionary principle. And we also live in a world where it's not remotely the case, I'm afraid, that scientists are the only people accorded a place at the high table of policy formulation. Only a few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to be in Cardiff, where the Welsh Assembly is at the moment considering whether they should change the law on organ donation to move to a system where they will have to opt out. Otherwise, they will automatically be placed on the organ donor register. There were almost no scientists involved in the evidence-giving session there. Instead, the evidence-giving session was devoted to opinion from lawyers, to opinion from economists, to opinion from surgeons, and even, dare I say it, to the opinion of a philosopher. Now, it seems to me that all of that is evidence that we live a long, long way from this world where too much trust is placed in science. And so I urge you to oppose the motion.
Thank you, Dr. Lewens. We will now take a short floor round. We'll take points in order of proposition, opposition, and then abstention. If you'd like to make a speech, please state your name and college before you do so. Wait for a microphone to reach you before you speak. And please do keep all speeches to a maximum of 1 minute. So first, does anyone have a point they'd like to make in proposition of the motion? That is, that too much trust is placed in science. Yeah, one in the middle down there.
Hello, this is Samantha from Fitzwilliam College. I lived in Japan, and I was there during the 3/11 tsunami disaster crisis. And in Japan, people have a great trust in science. And the communities around the coastline, they trusted the hazard maps that the scientists had prepared for them to say where tsunami waves would get to. They trusted the warning they received after the earthquake to say that the waves were going to hit and they were going to be 3 meters high. Now, the 1,000-year event was known about by science for 10 years, but they hadn't bothered to, or they had just assumed by probability that things wouldn't happen and they wouldn't change the hazard map. So this trust in science meant that many people presumed they didn't need to evacuate. They had 28 minutes to get to the high ground. And no doubt many people falsely believed that, yes, the hazard map said the people lower down will be affected, but their house was safe, and that the 3-meter wave wouldn't affect them over the 10-meter wall. But as we know from the past, this wasn't the case.
Thank you. Can I take a point in opposition, please? Yeah.
Milad Jalali, Homerton College. Even if science's empirical success does not come from its approximate truth, what other outlet do we have to understand the world in an empirical and objective manner which is as successful as science? You gave the example of the Japanese tsunami. Well, I ask you, how many lives have been saved by antibiotics, by the understanding of key physics, and in terms of that, why should we reduce? What other outlet is there to put more trust in than science to give us a good empirical understanding of our world?
And finally, for now, please appoint an abstention of the motion. That means you're not going in proposition or opposition. Yeah, just down there.
Hi, I'm Anna from Darwin College. I'd like to say I'm a bit disappointed that the main topic of the debate changed. I think that was very interesting. I think this debate can also be very interesting, but I'm still making a point of abstinence because I really don't know what too much trust in science actually means. And I think Tim Lewens has made some good points about what it could mean, but I would like to hear more about that before I can decide. Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you. We will now go back to our main debate. We'll have another floor round slightly later. But continuing the case for the proposition is the local MP, Liberal Democrat MP here in Cambridge. Dr. Julian Huppert has campaigned extensively in that role for science to have a broader role in the policy-making process. Julian Huppert.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here, and thank you for the invitation to say a bit more as well. Let me just start off by saying it's a great pleasure to follow Tim. We largely agree on most things, and I hope that I'll persuade him to agree with us on this occasion that one should always be sceptical, and that is the core of the scientific method. But let me start off by saying, asking the question, is it true, as Tim was suggesting, there are people who do not trust science enough? Are there anywhere in this country people like that? And the answer, I'm afraid, is yes, and most of them are in the House of Commons. So we are not trying to say that there is nobody anywhere who shouldn't trust science more. That's not the point we're making. The question is, are there risks in trusting science far too much? And I am a scientist. I'm passionate about how great science is. And that's why I care so much about this issue. There's a problem with how science is taught at school. Science is taught as a series of cold, hard facts. This chemical has that colour. This thing does this. And that leaves a lot of people thinking that all of science is about cold, hard facts. That we know things, that we're not going to change them, that we don't have any probabilistic views on them, no statistical analyses. And that is a huge problem. So science is great. I used to do completely pure research. It was great fun. Somewhat to my surprise, it turned out to be incredibly useful as well. And even if you talk to any scientists, they'll be a bit honest about how you shouldn't quite trust everything that's written in a paper, everything that's always there. That a typical result generally means the result I liked the most. I was a chemist, and graphs, straight line graphs, are fantastically powerful. I was always told, well, sometimes told, the chemist's rule. Only ever take 3 data points, because then there'll always be some type of graph paper where it's a straight line. And the corollary to that was, if you only have 1 type of graph paper, take 2 data points. Now, this is actually quite serious. I was looking up earlier a wonderful paper in Nature, published at the time of one of the previous Olympics. And they had a look at the winning time for the men's 100 metres, and it vaguely fits a straight line. And they looked at the winning time for the women's 100 metres, and it vaguely fits a straight line. Slightly higher gradient. So in 2056, women will run the 100 metres faster than men. And about 20 years later, women will run the 100 metres in less than 0 time. That got them a Nature paper. So if you're trying out there, you have some chance. And there's a lot of statistics. And when it comes to making decisions using science, it becomes a lot harder. Take anything in medicine. Now, and I was actually struck by this for real with a particular decision at Addenbrooke's. If you're trying to decide between 2 different cancer treatments, you might care what the 15-year life expectancy is. You might try and look it up. We don't know the 15 life expectancy of almost any medical treatment that's being used at the moment, certainly in the cancer field, for the excellent reason that they haven't been done for 15 years. We have no idea. You cannot trust science to tell you which one there is. The best data we have on medical 15-year life expectancy after a medical treatment is about 20 years old. That's how long it takes to do the analyses. You cannot trust science in that. You have to be skeptical. You have to look far more broadly. And I face, as a politician, every day, the challenge of how to make policy. And Tim spoke about some of these. And I'm passionate about evidence-informed policy. What that doesn't mean, and there are people who think it should, is that you just do what the best academic in the country says is the right thing to do, because it doesn't work like that. Now, you can use science to discard ideas. For example, homeopathy. It doesn't work. It's quite simple. So you shouldn't offer it on the NHS as something that does work. There is a placebo effect, but that's a different subject. So you can use science, and you should base your policy, you should use policy to inform, evidence to inform your policy. Let me give you another example, another one I'm passionate about, drugs policy. And again, Tim referred to the case of David Nutt. Now, science can tell you some things. It can tell you what the annual death rate is from ecstasy. It can tell you what the annual death rate is from horse riding. It can tell you those two things quite accurately. What it can't do, and what you cannot and must not trust it to do, is to tell us which of those should be legal, which of those should not be legal. Because we haven't, as a society, made the value judgment about what we're trying to achieve. It's not just about death minimization. Now, I personally am passionately pro-liberalisation, decriminalisation, the Portuguese model. It's fantastic. But you can't just work that out from a scientific analysis. You can look at the fantastic Portuguese model, but no matter how hard you look at the science, you can't trust it because we don't know what will happen in the UK if you follow the Portuguese model. Yeah.
There's a difference between collecting data and interpolating results out of it. I mean, from a set of data, you can have one outcome, you can have a different outcome. There's a difference between collecting the data and drawing conclusions out of it.
Yes, absolutely. You can collect the data. You should collect the data. What you cannot do is just trust it to tell you exactly what decisions to make. You cannot do that, and you must not do that, and there are people who are trying to push in order to do that. You've had a couple, so I'll see if anybody else wants to come in. So we will definitely get things wrong if we ignore science. And as I say, sadly, too many of my colleagues are in that category. But we will also get it wrong if we over-assume what science can do. And we heard from Samantha, I think, an excellent point earlier about what can happen if you do place too much trust in science. If you assume it will tell you far more. Her example was about Japan. I was going to give an example about the Italian earthquakes, where it was believed that geologists would be able to correctly predict whether or not there was going to be an earthquake. They were wrong. They were prosecuted for failing to predict it. Can I finish the point that I'm trying to make? Now, I think it is absolutely disgraceful that they were prosecuted. They should not have been prosecuted for that. What they should have been much clearer about was what the risks were, what the error bars were, what the lack of certainty was. If you ignore error bars, if you place too much trust, then you get over-accurate but unhelpful answers. Yeah?
You say that science in Italy did not know that it could happen. In fact, one of those people that were later on prosecuted had 5 years earlier written a paper predicting exactly that event. So, yes, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, but there it was more of a human error that was at fault than science itself.
My criticism is not of the geologists. It's the fact that there was a culture which believed that you could ask a group of scientists, will there be a volcano, and get a yes or a no answer. It is something that very many of us do. I'll take one more point. If you want it to be you, it can be you.
Does that not have more in common with a non-scientific belief system? This trust in authority, whether it's the authority of a scientist or a shaman? Isn't the scientific method really about first examining the facts and doing the science and not taking it on somebody's authority?
Absolutely. The scientific method is all about not over-trusting in science. That is precisely what it is all about. So thank you very much for making that point. Because that is exactly what I was going to go on to say. Science is all about not trusting it. The motto of the Royal Society, nullius in verba, essentially saying don't just take somebody's word for it, don't just trust them. Think for yourself. That is exactly what you have to do. if you place trust in the facts, you won't actually be developing science. You won't be acting in a scientific way. All the creative developments in science happen when somebody looked at something that everybody knew was right, and they said, doesn't quite look right, I don't quite trust that. And that's when you look more carefully and you find something new and you find something different. It is all about questioning. It is all about making sure you do not trust too much. Thank you. That was a 1-minute warning rather than a finish, but I'll happily take applause whenever you want. Tim mentioned economics and whether economics counts as a science, and it's certainly true that economists have correctly predicted 10 of the last 5 recessions. But the problem with economics happened when it tried to become more of a science, when it became more mathematical, when Black and Scholes came up with their equations that people trusted because they were mathematical, because they were scientific. That is when people placed too much trust in it, and the entire system collapsed because of an excess of trust in that issue. Science is great. It tells us some facts, some conclusions, some predictions, but it doesn't tell us everything. So what I would say to you is listen to science, think about science, learn from science, but never just trust it. Don't let others just trust it. So I urge you to support this motion, to vote for science, and vote for the scientific method. Thank you very much. Is that all right? Very good.
Thank you, Julian. To continue the case for the opposition is the editor of the hugely popular magazine New Scientist, Mr. Jeremy Webb.
Well, I find myself in the rather peculiar position of agreeing with the proposition, but I agree with Tim as well. So this is hugely disappointing. I would like to. I would just like to point out that predicting the future, even for science, is a little much. So with the tsunami, one wonders how many lives were actually saved by those walls that were erected. Obviously, many people died because they assumed too much, but the walls were there and probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives that we haven't heard about. In the case of the Italians and the... Sure, yeah. Well, tens of thousands. Okay, thank you. And as far as the Italian earthquake is concerned, the error bars were there. The scientists had done and given all of the correct warnings. Unfortunately, the communication of the final message was left to a government employee. And the problem was that message was screwed up, basically. And that is why these scientists are in the dock. Now, I want to start my presentation with really a modern version of a scene from a film that I hope you will recognize. The place is a filthy hovel near Jerusalem, and a meeting is underway. It's the People's Front of Judea. And they're plotting against one particular group in society. In my version of this scene, the head of the PFJ, a chap known as Reg, asks, "What have scientists ever done for us?" It's a rhetorical question, but he's surprised by the answers. Well, the heliocentric solar system, the circulation of the blood, thermodynamics. All right, says Reg, apart from those things, the atomic theory of matter, quantum mechanics, relativity. Reg is getting flustered. So, apart from the heliocentric solar system, circulation of the blood, thermodynamics, atomic theory of matter, quantum mechanics and relativity, what have scientists ever done for us? Evolution? Okay, that's the end of the scene, but I hope you get my drift. I should also apologise to the writers of The Life of Brian. My point is that we understand a huge amount about ourselves, the world around us, the universe in which we live, thanks to the efforts of modern scientists over the last 350 years. But of course, the successes of science don't end there. If I can switch media to television, there's an advert running for the Cancer Research UK at the moment that you may have seen. In the 1960s, only 1 child in 10 survived leukemia. Today, 8 out of 10 children survive because of one thing, research. That's what the advert says. And this, of course, is the other side of the success of science. Once we understand something, we have a better chance of manipulating it and creating technologies. Drugs that cure leukemia are just one example. Other medicines have dramatically cut maternal and neonatal death rates. Vaccines and antibiotics have prevented millions of deaths from infections. Fertility treatments have allowed many people to start families who wouldn't otherwise have been able to do so. There are plenty of obvious things around us every day. The internal combustion engine, aircraft, computers and the internet. But there are also things that you don't see that you take for granted. The auto-focusing camera on your mobile telephone has a network in it, a silicon version of brain cells that were uncovered in the 1950s. GHD hair straighteners have a lightweight ceramic in them, discovered in the 1950s to have very useful thermal properties, which are used in hair straighteners. And if you use a multi-blade razor, you are using an effect called hair hysteresis to get a smoother finish. Now, science is everywhere, and we use it and we trust it every day. I want to give a rider, which has been pointed out, and that is that science is not perfect. It is flawed like all other human endeavours. Scientists are not always objective. They do things for the wrong reasons, and science goes up blind alleys and it has to get itself back down. But ultimately, it is self-correcting. Somebody will have a better theory or find evidence that renders the old theory irrelevant. So in my humble opinion, the scientific method is the most successful knowledge system we have for understanding nature. And I think it's the most trustworthy. Whether that description is deserved is up to you to decide. Now, I'm not sure that other knowledge systems can claim that same authority. And I want to ask, if we're not going to trust scientists, who are we going to trust? Sorry, if we're not going to trust science in general, who are we going to trust? If you have to solve the problem of climate change,
anybody, but are critical and cautious about risking
all? I'm not going to disagree with you that if we haven't got data and we haven't got theories, that we should make them up. I mean, that is the antithesis of science. If you're asked to solve a question like climate change, staunch an outbreak of a novel emerging disease, or give advice on the likely pathway of a hurricane, I hope it's self-evident you're going to call. It's not going to be a philosopher or a politician or a banker or an economist. It's going to be the relevant scientist. Now, many of the problems that New Scientist covers are global in scope. And I think that if one looks at politics, I think global politics is moribund at the moment. What we're finding is that national politics are getting in the way of solving global problems. And that can be about solving the debt crisis in Europe or reaching the UN's Millennium Development Goals, which we are going to miss by a country mile. So I think that science is the best thing around that we have for understanding the world around us. I think that politics and philosophy and all those other disciplines have a place. They have a role to play. I am not suggesting that science is the only game in town, but it has a very, very important role. So let me end by posing a question that's slightly different from tonight's motion, and that is, who is it that thinks that science is not trustworthy, and why do they think it? And my feeling, looking at the proposers, is that it's clearly the practitioners of other knowledge systems, the philosophers, the priests, and the politicians. Yes?
Raymond Wright, Trinity College. I'm sure the issue though is whether we should be whether we're placing too much trust in the science. I don't think the other people are necessarily saying that science in itself is not trustworthy, but just are we placing too much trust in it?
Okay, thank you. Why do these other disciplines not like science at the moment? Why are they saying that it's not, we shouldn't trust it so much? And I think that science is treading on their toes. It's making life harder for them. Let's take morality, a classic preserve of philosophers. And we've already had, you can't use science to ask the question why. Is this question out of bounds of science? And I don't think so. A couple of examples. Primate biologists have found good evidence of rudimentary moral systems in social animals such as chimps. They're similar to ours, suggesting that those systems evolved and they will evolve in other animals. There is growing evidence that our abhorrence of incest is less to do with moral teaching than an evolved aversion to incestuous unions because they tend to produce less fit offspring. Now, science is unlikely, I agree, to produce quick, simple answers to long-standing moral questions, but those results should inform our viewpoint and they will change our perspective. Religion. Science has shown that thinking religious thoughts can lower your blood pressure. There are meta-studies that have found that intercessory prayer doesn't work. In politics, the latest fashion is for evidence-based policy, and of course we want to know that that policy works. Now, to find out these things, you need systematic evidence, and some of the studies that have been done verge on the scientific. Restorative justice is a case in point. There have been good controlled studies showing that in some categories of offence, restorative justice benefits victim and offender. The big question is, can we afford to do it? And as has already been alluded before, on policy making, what does a government do when its scientific advisors tell it that when dealing with the evidence of harm and drug dependence, there is no justification for ecstasy being a Class A drug and cannabis being Class B? As has already been said, the last government tied itself in knots about that, chiefly because it had not decided what criteria it was going to use to decide how its policy should be made. So my point is that scientific findings in these cases tend to constrain the thoughts and actions of politicians, philosophers, and priests. Scientific results can be unforgiving. They are difficult to challenge, and so they are threatening. How, for example, does a politician advocate a popular party policy when systematic studies have shown that it doesn't or hasn't worked? How can a priest continue to ask people to pray for a sick member of the congregation when scientific study has shown that that sort of prayer doesn't work? So in this motion, I see a quantity of sour grapes. People wishing that science would leave their fields alone. The reaction in these cases is often to undermine science and the people who practice it or cast aspersions on their motives. In an extreme form, that's what the tobacco industry has been doing for the last 50 years, and it's what's happening in the debate about climate change now. But what can be wrong with honest observation and careful reasoning in any and every field? The real enemy here is ignorance, and I'm certain that nobody here wants any of that. So I hope you will agree with me and reject the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. This is the point of the debate where you get to have your say. The same drill as before. Please state your name and college before you start speaking. Don't do so until you've got a microphone in your hand. And please, no speeches longer than 1 minute. Can I take, firstly then, another point in proposition of the motion, please? Yep, down there.
Hello, Oliver, Christ's College. Can you just repeat the exact title of the debate?
This House believes too much trust is placed in science.
Okay, so when you say this house, I think there's a certain amount of ambiguity in who this house is, because on one side we've got Tim arguing that politicians aren't placing enough trust in science. On the other side, we've got Julian arguing that cancer patients, etc., are placing too much trust in science. Then they're not the same people. But following on from that, I'd like to push Tim slightly on the point of politicians placing too much trust in science, in that I think his imaginary world is entirely possible, or indeed is entirely possible now, in that politicians can place too much trust in science but still not act on it. And I think that is a perfectly fair explanation for our world today, not that politicians don't trust science.
And a point in opposition, please. Yep, down there.
I'm a bit confused by Julian Huppert's speech that we should not place too much trust in science because the scientific method tells us not to. I mean, I'm not sure what the distinction is between science and the scientific method. To me, science doesn't mean the body of knowledge that we have at the moment. Science, because that's always changing. Science is the scientific method. That's what the debate is about, to me. That's what it seems like. If you're saying that the scientific method is what we should be using to find out about the world, then surely you should be on the opposition side. I mean, that's what I believe. We should be using the scientific method.
Thank you. What was your name in college?
Toby Clifford, King's College.
Okay, thank you. And a point in abstention, please. Yep.
Hi, Callum Bungay, St Catherine's College. I broadly agree pretty much with most of what you've all said. Science is the best system we have for understanding the world around us and for gaining knowledge from it. But though, for this house to believe that we have too much trust in science, kind of ignores the fact that that this house is split entirely. Although C.P. Snow said it many, many decades ago, we still live in a world of two cultures. Those who understand science, many who practice science, and generally the more scientifically literate public, and also the scientifically illiterate public. And we have those who understand the limitations of science, who understand that these results will tell us certain things but can't tell us other things, which the first few speakers all admitted to very well, and most people in science understand the limitations of that. But we then have people who don't understand the limitations and put too much emphasis on this because they don't understand what the science is actually saying. So we have the people in Japan who have these earthquake maps, and then we're getting scientific information getting mixed up with scientifically illiterate economists and city planners, therefore making poor judgments on risk. So how can we really say, and then we have other scientifically illiterate people who place no trust in science at all, the chemophobes who want to live in a world without science, without chemicals at all, and I tell you now, you will asphyxiate very quickly. So our understanding of science is such a mess right now that I really can't say that we trust too much or too little. We really just need to sort ourselves out. Thank you.
Is that abstention? Can I take another point in proposition of the motion, please? Yeah, just there.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from Darwin College. I would like to say two things. First of all, I think that science definitely has a great value, in some cases even a monopolistic value. But we can't deny the fact that science has been exported into areas where it's not really appropriate. And when we talk about science, we talk about evidence, and we talk about evidence, we talk about measuring. And there are things in life that can't be measured, like emotions and all these numerous things that influence us, that we just, for example, in economics is the discipline about how humans interact, and you can't measure everything that's going on there. And then secondly, I also think that the way we conduct science today is sometimes has become really inappropriate sometimes. I mean, when when we undertake research, we have to hand in a research proposal before we even have carried out the experiment. So we're kind of saying what we want to find out before we even start. And Alexander Fleming would never have discovered penicillin if he hadn't just stumbled upon a moldy petri dish. So I think, yeah, those are the two issues that I wanted to talk about.
Can I take another point in opposition, please? Lots of hands, lots of hands. Yeah, just there.
Thank you. Eleanor Casimir, Corpus Christi College. I'd just like to say something quite controversial to spice up the debate. I don't personally think that the scientific method belongs in policy making or decision making in the forum of policymakers, and that is because I think scientists should apply the methods when they do science, but they shouldn't necessarily do so when they're negotiating, because that's a different language spoken. It leads to stalling in policy making, such as, for example, everything that we've seen so far with climate change. The reason we're not making hard and fast decisions, which I believe we should be doing in terms of pushing the climate change agenda forward, and that is because we're completely obsessed with confidence levels. We're obsessed with showing that unless something is 95% confident, unless we're 95% confident with our findings, we don't believe it should be taken forward. And obviously that is not how, that is just taken to be a point against us. The same is true for something like the maximum sustainable yield with fisheries and so on. Scientists are just not very good at negotiating. They take things way too specifically and strictly, which is very valid in terms of pushing the science forward, but does not belong in decision-making procedures. Thank you.
What was that? And another point in abstention, please. Yeah.
Hi, Chris Owen, Emmanuel College. I think the problem with this debate is that we haven't really defined the terms, do we trust science too much to do what? Do we trust science to tell us what happened before the universe, if such thing exists? No. Can we trust science to tell us what variety of toothpaste to use? Perhaps if a Scottish lady in a nice lab coat tells us. Well, I'd hope not. Can I trust science to get me laid? No. But can we trust science to make advances in our standard of living? Probably yes. It's about balance.
Back to proposition, please. Go on then.
Okay, Austin Mahler, Trinity Hall.
1 minute.
I always feel bad.
Austin, this will be the only 1 minute speech you've ever given. So.
My time starts now. Well, I think the proposition hasn't done a very excellent job defining the proposition, so maybe I'll give them a little bit of help and go with the original motion. This House believes science has an undeserved monopoly on truth. And maybe we can extrapolate. We believe science is trusted too much we use science to the exclusion of everything else. We fail to admit the limits of science. And when we rely on science, we reject other sources of truth, such as, and I'm going to say this horrible word, religion. Now, I did some DIY over the holiday. I had a miter saw that I used to cut the molding. I had a nail gun to nail it in, and I had a tape measure to measure the length of the molding. But none of the tools in my toolkit could have told me if the molding matched the walls. I think we need to look at science the same way. Science is a toolkit. And that toolkit is wonderful, it's excellent, it can get us the perfect molding. But we need to accept that we can't reject all other perspectives that might be useful for telling us if the molding matches. Might be useful for telling us not what the human body is, but what we should be doing with it.
Thank you. We're on opposition, I believe. Go on, mate.
Clara Keyes College. I find it difficult to put too much trust in science, let alone much trust at all, when it's a field that, just by looking at this panel, is clearly exclusive to men. No, I mean, I'm not kidding, right? And so I think that how can I trust a field that appears to exclude women, or at the very least must discourage our participation somehow, if you look at this panel or if you look at the statistics of the amount of men and women in science? And I find it difficult to trust scientific facts on women's health issues when women are actively discouraged from taking part in the scientific discussion on those issues.
And another point in abstention, please. Yes. Can I get a microphone, guys? Austin.
Oh, sorry, wrong person.
Hopeless.
Hi, Sophie, King's College. Just in response to the last speaker, as a woman in science, I'd like to say that I don't necessarily think... I would say just in this panel, I don't necessarily think the issue is that women aren't represented in science, though obviously if you look at high levels in science, we aren't represented properly. But I think a lot of the issue comes from the choosing of speakers for the union. I'm sure there are plenty of female speakers. I'm sorry, I come to the union, I enjoy it, but I'm just saying, I think there are plenty of female speakers who could have provided really interesting answers to this topic. So the makeup of this panel doesn't necessarily reflect the makeup of female scientists in general, but rather whoever chose the panel and sent out the invitations for this event. Thanks.
I'm going to do another round because there were lots of hands up. So a final point in proposition, please. Yeah.
Patrick Welsh, Trinity Hall. I think the scientific method's perfect, so I'm not going to complain about that. But maybe there's too much trust in scientists. It's a bit like what Austin said. Scientists, they come up with their own theories and their own views, and they run away with them. Like once they've got going with their career, they'll form a particular worldview. I think maybe it's too simplistic and too. If you read New Scientist, some people's articles are they run with one particular theme, and maybe that's the thing. Maybe scientists need to have more thoughtful, like basically philosophy. But so maybe it's the scientists more than the scientific method, because the method, of course, how can you object to people investigating things ever? So it's a bit like Austin's idea, just of more interpretive value of the results. Okay, thank you.
Just that we invite lots of people. A final point in opposition, please.
James Bailey, Pembroke College. I have to say that the proposition's argument seems to be based on some assumptions which are, have been repeated by pretty much everybody speaking for them, but which I haven't heard significant evidence to back up. Firstly, there is this continued assumption that there are a load of people out there who are going around blindly trusting science and scientists. I don't know who these people are. I don't know them. I'm not sure who does know them, but I'd quite like to be introduced to a couple of them. But I don't see any evidence that these are such a large group that they are the driving force in our society. There may be a couple of people who place too much trust in science, but to make it hold as an overall motion, you've actually got to be persuading me that actually there are quite a lot of people in this category, and if they are, they're sort of conspicuously inconspicuous. The other proposition which I would like to come to is the idea of the cases in Italy and in Japan. And what I would say there is, you're saying, okay, people put their trust in the science turned out to be wrong. That was a tragedy. are you then saying that because of that, what we need is actually less science? Are we assuming that instead we should have a blind panic whenever there is a catastrophe instead? Because I would say that this is an example where, okay, the science was wrong. What we need, therefore, is more science, better explained, better funded, with discussion of, as Julian was very rightly saying, the error bars, where we can actually use science properly. But that's an example of a place where we really need more science, not less. Thank you.
And a final point in abstention of the motion, please. Yes.
Toby, Darwin. I suppose my problem is that I think that there are some people who trust science too much for the wrong reasons, and some people who don't trust science enough for the wrong reasons. I think that drugs policy is an excellent example of the second group. I think that there's a slightly worrying trend of people, or a worrying trend rather, of people who think that the scientific explanation is the only explanation that you need. Can think of a certain Facebook group that sometimes sends around pictures informing me that oxytocin is love, which I don't believe. Those kinds of things. I think that to limit yourself to that worldview is a bit worrying. So I'm abstaining because I think that it's you can't pick one side or the other in this debate.
Thank you, and thank you to all our floor speakers. To just respond to the point over there, it's important to note that female speakers, a range of speakers, both male and female, are invited for every debate. Who accepts those invitations is largely out of their hands, but I think it's important to note that we do invite a whole range of speakers for every single debate, and this one was no exception to that. To get back to our main debate, and closing the case for the proposition is Seb Faulk. Seb is a graduate researcher in the History and Philosophy of Sciences department. Seb.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry if I wasn't the person you were expecting to see, or should I say the man you were expecting to see. They invited another man at the last minute, and I'm sorry for not being a woman, but I'm not sorry for what I'm about to say. And one of the ways I think in which I fit the bill better than some other people might do is that I fit this two cultures, which one of the floor speakers mentioned quite adequately, in that I'm a historian trying to understand science, usually failing. But the dichotomy which the speaker identified really wasn't actually between the historians or the artists and the scientists, which C.P. Snow was going on about in the 1950s. Actually, the dichotomy which has been identified, and which has been identified all this evening, is between clever people and stupid people. And when you decide who to support, whether to vote no or aye in this debate, what you really need to decide for yourself is whether you think people are clever or whether they're stupid. Now, I'm going to attempt to convince you that most people are stupid. I will start by arguing that it has been and can be possible to put too much trust in science. And then I'll continue by arguing that it is actually happening right now. And then I will conclude with a few points summing up what my colleagues have said. Now, as I said, I study the history of science, and you might say, well, what business has history got to do with this, because the question is framed in the present tense. But unless you think that science has reached perfection and there's nothing new to be discovered and everything that we believe now will remain the case forever and will never be disproved, I think history has something to teach us. And in this context, I'm going to show you a beautiful piece of science. Does anybody know what this is? It's an astrolabe. Okay? Now, an astrolabe is a tool. Now, we've used the word tool a number of times this evening. And science is a tool, an astrolabe is a tool for science. It can tell us an awful lot. It can tell us the time. It can tell us the height of a building. It can tell us what constellation the sun is in at any particular time of the year. And it can tell us which star will rise next on the horizon. It does these jobs extremely well. The question is, what do you do with this information? You could use it for purely disinterested purposes, simply because you have the pleasure of finding things out. But it was never, or not only, used for these purposes. An astrolabe was a very practical tool. Some things it was used for example, were to decide what time to say your prayers to God, something which a member of the opposition already told us was rather pointless and should be discounted. It could also be used to decide from which vein blood should be let on any particular day. Another procedure which most doctors would today argue is not really very necessary. So this is a tool. Science is a tool. It can be a source of tremendous information. It can also mislead us hugely. Now, you will say, and the opposition will say, well, what's this got to do with the motion? Because we're talking about now. And you'll say, oh, well, since astrolabes were popular, we've discovered the scientific method. And the scientific method is normally the product of this idea called a scientific revolution that happened sometime perhaps in the late 17th century or something like that. Now, that's all very well and good, but if I then challenge you to say, well, what is a science and what is this one scientific method, you might find it actually a little bit harder to define. We've already heard from the opposition that there is no credible case for thinking that economics is a science. Okay, so economics is out the window. Sorry to all you economists there. We've also heard from another member of the opposition that predicting the future is too hard. So science shouldn't be expected to predict the future. Now, so what's left for science? It can't predict the future. It can tell us what's happened in the past, I suppose. The present is here now, gone tomorrow. So what actually does science do for us? Well, normally when people try and explain what science does for us, they normally resort to history. They normally say, oh, well, science has done this, science has done that, and we had a beautiful litany of examples from a member of the opposition of all the things that science has done, thus justifying and proving that the historical method is superior to the scientific method. Now, of course, I'm not arguing that science is not a tremendous tool. Science is amazing. Science is wonderful. But it's not a question, as the second speaker for the opposition implied, of what science has ever done for us. No one is ever arguing, or no one on this side anyway, is arguing that science is untrustworthy, as has been insinuated. What we're saying simply is that science is a tremendous tool, but it can be used in many ways. And if the scientific method means anything, it means to be skeptical, as has been rightly said. But that means that it has to be self-skeptical. It has to recognize its own limitations. Now, in what remains of what I'm going to say, I'm going to give you some examples of where science today is failing to recognize its own limitations. Now, first of all, I want to address something that was said from the floor, which was arguing that science actually is not that trusted and that many people are very distrustful of science. Well, when I watch TV, I see adverts all the time which talk about, here comes the science bit. Here's the science. And then they include some long word that normally involves polypeptides or hairamides or beardamides. You know the story. Now, maybe you think that everybody is skeptical about this. But I think that actually people are going out and buying these products, otherwise they wouldn't bother advertising them. Now, it's been rightly said that, oh, I'm sorry about this. It's been rightly said that technology has done an awful lot to improve our lives, but equally, we must admit that just when we think we've mastered technology, it has an awful tendency to come and bite us in the arse. An example for it would be CFCs. Now, maybe some of you around here don't remember the campaigns to remove CFCs from aerosols. CFCs were a wonderful solution to a very clear problem. However, too much trust was placed in the science, and the adverse consequences to the ozone layer were not recognized. The same could be said for lead in fuel, or, as we've already heard, the hazard maps produced by the Japanese scientists. Yes?
Was it not science that told us that CFCs were dangerous?
That's absolutely correct. And I'm not for a moment arguing that science should be ignored because it makes mistakes. But we have to have a critical eye, and we have to admit that it is trusted and that it has made mistakes. Now, yes?
Then what you're saying is actually that science itself is fine because it's self-correcting. It's that we have too much trust in scientists.
That is possibly the case, but I think that most people conflate science with scientists. So I think it comes to the same thing. Yes, but because we have too much trust in scientists, we have too much trust in science. Now, who are these scientists? Well, we've heard they're not women. Who they often are, actually, are people who feel forced to lobby politicians and policy advisors. And these are the people who feel forced to interpret what the scientists are telling them. Now, the scientists are, in turn, feel forced to give a clear message which the politicians will be able to understand very easily, because, as we've heard, decisions are never easy in science. So, in fact, the people who we should be looking at carefully are the policy advisors. These are the people who are forced to make these difficult decisions, to weigh up these conflicting evidence which is given them by scientists, and they come up, understandably, with answers that may not be the ones which are ultimately beneficial because they put too much trust in science. Right, it's up to me to conclude now, I'm afraid. I'll just conclude. I watched a very interesting TV program about a year ago, presented by Sir Paul Nurse, who you may have heard of. He's the president of the Royal Society, Nobel Prize-winning scientist. The program was entitled Science Under Attack, and he argued that science was no longer trusted enough. He said that the solution for this was for scientists to be clearer, less nuanced, less equivocal. And he said that the reason that science is so wonderful is because, and he quoted the Royal Society motto, nullius in verba, we don't take anything on trust, so you should trust us. Now think about that for a minute. We don't take anything on trust, so you should take everything on trust from us. Now, this is a very eminent scientist arguing this. And I would say, to conclude, I apologize for this, that science is a tremendous tool. It's done huge things for us. But it should not be trusted blindly. This has happened in the past, and it is happening today. Thank you.
Thank you, Seb. To conclude the debate and the case for the opposition is Professor Stathis Psillos, who has flown from Athens, where he is a professor at the University of Athens in the philosophy of science and metaphysics, to be here tonight. He's also a founding member of the European Philosophy of Science Association. So, Professor Psillos.
Thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I'm deeply honored. I'm not a woman, but I'm from another minority. I'm non-English, native English speaker. But events like that show that it's important to be inclusive, even if somehow not all minorities, social minorities I mean, are represented. They're here, okay? And we respect that. Now, I'm very glad that the final speaker, the previous speaker actually brought in the history of science into the debate, because my starting point will be an attempt to tell you about some other debate like this, which took place about a century ago in France. It was a very lively debate. And it was centered around the so-called bankruptcy of science. It took place around 1895, and in the context of the French Third Republic, which was called the Republic of the Professors, precisely because it was supposed to actually put too much trust into science and the scientific spirit. There was even the thought that the French lost to the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 because they lost actually in the scientific spirit. The Germans were doing better science than them. So there was this important public debate which started when a religious professor of literary criticism and editor of an influential popular journal, Ferdinand Brunetière, published an article which shocked the scientific and political establishment by talking about the bankruptcy of science, la banqueroute de la science. The charge back then was that science had failed to deliver on its promise to change the face of the world. Science, Brunetière said, has left unexplained the origins of life, morality, mentality, and society. Science cannot replace religion and faith. It cannot raise and answer questions on issues that matter to humanity. The solace, he thought, was to be found in religion. We didn't quite get this tonight, but we get something like that from the proposition. What followed this was a huge public stir. Eminent scientists, novelists such as Émile Zola and Anatole France, religious leaders, various politicians were involved in a heated debate about the scope and the limits of science and its method. On the 5th of April of 1895, another union, not as eminent as this one, but very important in France, the Union of the Republican Youth, the Republic also was at stake back in 1870, offered a banquet in honor of Marcellin Berthelot, an eminent French chemist and foreign minister of the Republic, which was attended by the literary, philosophical, and scientific elite of Paris. The event was widely publicized. A journal which you all know very well, Nature, published a report on this event on the 18th of April, 1895, starting with the following sentences. In honor of Monsieur Berthelot, and as a demonstration of the power and progress of science in France, a banquet was held at Paris a few days ago. Upon the invitation cards were printed the words, "Homage to science, source of the emancipation of thought." A key message of those who defended science back then in a real debate that took place among real people, scientists and others, was that science emancipates thought in three ways. By the intellectual horizons it opens up, by the material means of action that it furnishes, and by the employment of its methods, the results of which are broadly verifiable. Far from being bankrupt, in the subsequent years, science went through major successes, such as the victory of the atomic conception of matter, the emergence of the special and the general theory of relativity. As time went by, areas of cognition that were considered to be not quite amenable to scientific inquiry, such as the mind, human behavior, human societies, languages, even human morality, went through major theoretical and experimental advancements. How would we react today to a claim that science is bankrupt? Think of the current motion to see the considerable change of emotions. No member of the proposition said that we shouldn't trust science. Everybody said we should, but not too much. But how much is too much? This question was not properly addressed. To me, the serious question is, should we trust science or should we not? And we can discuss about some issues that I want to raise in a couple of minutes. The key point, I take it, is that are there other ways to get to the truth and to achieve understanding of the world other than science? And if there are, we'd better be told what they are and why we should take them seriously. Here is a very general argument that I want to put to you. Suppose there is a non-scientific method or way to get to the truth about the natural world, let's say. Let's call this X, the unknown X. There are two options available. The first is that we arrive at exactly the same truths about the world by following this alternative method. The second is that we arrive at a different set of truths, at different truths by following this non-scientific method. In the first case, science would still be trusted. Why? Because we would have come to the very same truths by a different method, by a different way. Our confidence in science would have come to would have actually increased precisely because it would be as if we solved the same problem with two different methods. But let's think of the other case where this non-scientific method comes up with a different set of truths. Here again, the issue would not be, I put it to you, whether we should trust or not science. The issue would be which set of truths should we accept? Those arrived at by science or those arrived at by this different non-scientific method X? And the question is, on what basis would we actually accept or be reasonable to adopt the different set of truths? Would we rely on intuition? Would we rely on revelation? Would we rely on guesswork? The only way would be to try to test these truths by the scientific method. Yes?
So there seems to be a kind of implicit assumption that two systems of truth produced through different methods can't meaningfully coexist. If we have a certain set of truths got at through the scientific method, and then we have the whole, corpus of all the different truths that the historical, literary, sociological, whatever, other kinds of methods that just look at different kinds of evidence and use different methodologies, it doesn't seem to be at all obvious that you have to use any kind of system to pick between these two systems of truth.
No, what I'm saying is that they cannot be inconsistent with each other and both be true. So if they're inconsistent, we've got to choose. Otherwise, we live in contradiction. That's a choice, but that's a choice we have to make. I don't make it myself. Yeah?
What about sometimes when these methods X lead us to results about a certain field which science can't touch?
Yeah, this would be... This would be the question, and define the field. And just to reply to your point, let me just read what I was supposed to read. Suppose someone in the audience now got up and, speaking with the voice of an angel, started to prophesy things about the future, or to tell stories about the deep structure of the world, or about things that we have not heard about. And suppose further that these stories were inconsistent with what science tells us about the world. Would we all stand up and applaud this guy? I'm not quite sure. Would we actually try to use some methods to test, to examine his pronouncements? And what methods would this be? I take it could be the methods of science. What else?
On that point?
Yeah?
You appear to be arguing that the only way to test which method, whether the scientific method is appropriate, is by using the scientific method itself. Now, that seems to be begging the question somewhat. In other words, that it's hardly a fair test of a method to use itself to see whether it's appropriate.
Yeah. No, what I'm actually saying is that there is no other method we know of how to use to test a body of beliefs. So if there were some alternative method, we should see its credentials and try to find out whether actually leads to successes or explains things, and then probably starting taking it seriously.
What would you
Yes, if there is no problem with the time, yes. Oh, yeah.
That's not working.
You raise the issue where you have contradiction between two things, but that happens in the body of science anyway. We ought to trust relativity, we ought to trust quantum mechanics. They don't work together. We shouldn't trust either. We should always be looking for new truths, not trusting the ones that we have, but pushing further.
Yeah, precisely. That's exactly the point. What do we do then? We don't abandon science. We try to unify these two domains. We try to overcome the contradiction by synthesizing. But we do that by following scientific method, we do that by following the empirical results, and we do that by trying to have a coherent overall conception of the world. So we don't abandon science by doing that. So I think probably I'm running out of time. So if you just allow me to say a few more things that I want, which probably sway at least those who are in abstention at the moment. So science, I think, is the best way we humans have invented to push backwards the frontiers of ignorance and error. And precisely because it has succeeded in this endeavor, we should trust it and respect it. Science has had tremendous empirical success. This is an undeniable fact. But it is equally undeniable that this fact is radically contingent. Science could have been full of failures. The best explanation of this empirical success is that scientific theories have latched to the world. That is, that they are true or approximately true. This claim, I take it, warrants epistemic optimism. It warrants acceptance of the claim that science is on the right track. But there is an objection. The objection, we heard it actually from the previous speaker. Isn't it the case that past theories, which in their time were empirically successful and fruitful, turned out to be false and were abandoned? And the objector might continue. Isn't this the fate of current successful theories? If we look at the history of science as we ought, we'll certainly see breaks and discontinuities. The truth is hard to get, and science cannot get to it all at once. But if we look carefully at the history of science, we'll see substantial continuity in theory change. No new theory emerges the way Athena emerged, fully armed from Zeus's head. Substantive theoretical claims that feature in past theories and played a key role in their successes have been incorporated in subsequent theories and continue to play an important role in making these theories empirically successful. I'm drawing to a conclusion. Does that mean that science deserves uncritical support? Here is the question: how much is too much? This would be against the scientific spirit. Criticism is the name of the game in science. Scientific rationality is the model of rationality precisely because it brings together three key elements of rationality: reflection, epistemic responsibility, and responsiveness to reason. So what does defending science imply? Three commitments. The way the world is the final arbiter of all theoretical disagreement. The scientific method is by far the best way to know the world and to transform it. The betterment of the human condition requires knowing the ways of nature and the role and place of humans in it. So I urge you to vote against this motion. There is no better way to truth we have invented so far than science, and I have no evidence whatsoever at all that we're capable of inventing a better method. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Psillos, and thank you very much to all our speakers. Tomorrow night, to end a very busy week here at the Union, we have the former England football manager, Fabio Capello. He'll be speaking at 7:30, so please do come to that. Back to tonight, the result will be announced at the bar very shortly. As ever, the door by which you leave is significant. Eyes to the right, nose to the left, and abstentions down the middle. And thank you very much for coming.